And we're going to pick back up where we left off 2 weeks ago, looking at pop culture, and in particular looking at the heroic mythology associated with characters like Superman. Well, actually, let me phrase that. Associated specifically with Superman. What we're looking at here really has to do with the way that he has come to be portrayed in modern culture, specifically. Even most characters that have his kind of powers, and there are a number of different characters in pop culture, movies, and certainly comic books, but movies and TV shows now that have Superman's similar powers because he is an archetype for heroic characters. Most of them are not given the almost explicit biblical references that we see associated with Superman. So just for a quick review, we're going to go back and take a look at the two previews or trailers that I showed you a couple of weeks ago to kind of put us back on track. These are from the most recent Superman movie that actually has been released. Now there's a new one that's coming out in less than a month, early July. There's a new Superman that's coming out, and it appears that it may, at least from the trailers, it may be moving away from some of the more explicitly Christian imagery or biblical imagery that we see in some of the other the more Superman movies. But that remains to be seen. There's elements of it that you could, from some of the trailers that I've seen, that would suggest that they may have some of that in there, and they may not. And there's a variety of reasons, including the increasing secularization of Hollywood, that they may want to move away from that. But nevertheless, we'll wait and kind of see how that turns out. But these are the two trailers from the movie, excuse me, that there's the previous one called Man of Steel that was released back in, it was almost 10 years actually, it was about 10 years ago now that was actually released. So let's see if I can get this to play. Looks like it. Let's see if it has any sound. Yep, okay.
Even though you've been raised as a human being, you are not one of them.
Mistaken. That is actually from the previous Superman movie, which was they called Superman Returns. So hopefully this is the one actually from Man of Steel. We'll find out in a second here. Together. Exciting.
Fog's too big, Mom. Then make it small. Focus on my voice. Pretend it's an island out in the ocean. Can you see it? I see it. My son was in the bus. He saw what Clark did.
Side of yourself a secret.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe. Those are my questions. Where do I come from? You just have to decide what kind of man you want. I grew up to be, Clay. Whoever that man is, he's gonna change the world.
Okay, so actually that worked better than I expected because it actually portrays both of the most recent portrayals of Superman on film, which was the one that Superman Returns, which was a follow-on to the original Richard Donner, Christopher Reeve version of Superman. So, as I talked about, what is this? This is not what I'm doing. Don't need that. There we go. Okay. So, as I talked about early on, several weeks ago, Superman was created by these two guys, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the artist and the writer. They were two Jewish boys from New York, and the original Superman was not a world-spanning hero. He was a localized kind of a hero. He was an American hero. That's why his key phrase was truth, justice, and the American way. His powers were relatively limited compared to the modern Superman. He was strong and tough, and he could jump really far, and that was about it. The modern Superman is incredibly strong, incredibly resilient. He can fly. He has all sorts of vision powers and heat vision and all sorts of things that he can do. And so he's evolved over time, as most comic book heroes tend to do. But when Siegel and Shuster created him, they probably did not have in mind a Christ metaphor for it. In their case, the Superman character, and we see an element of the thinking that goes into this, the Superman character is a two-part character. He has a human identity and a Kryptonian identity. His human identity is Clark Kent. And in the second preview or trailer that we saw a minute ago, when he talks about his father thinking the world wasn't ready for him, he's talking about his human father, the father that raised him, Jonathan Kent. And the human father doesn't really know what his purpose is, doesn't really understand what he's supposed to do, and is simply focused on protecting him from a world that would probably be afraid of him and confused about him, especially if he doesn't use his powers in a way that would be beneficial. His Kryptonian side, anybody know what his Kryptonian name is? Ian does. Well, he did. We may not remember it at this point. His Kryptonian name is Kal-El. His father's name is Jor-El, and they are, the L part is the house that they are a part of. And so his house is referred to in some versions of the Superman mythology as the House of El. Now, does that sound familiar to anybody? That word El? A little biblical, yes. It is a very, very significant biblical word. You see it over and over again in Hebrew. The last two characters there, the one that looks like an upside down L and the one that kind of looks like an N or an X, those two characters form a word called El. And in this particular word, it's the word El Shaddai. The Hebrew being read backwards, the Shaddai part actually is the part before it. But the word El comes up a lot in Hebrew writing, in Canaanite writing as well. What does the word El mean? Anybody know?
Is it singular for God?
It is. It is a singular for God. Buck, what were you going to say, or did you start to raise your hand?
Well,
I was going to say the.
Okay, well, it's Spanish. I should have called it that. So El Shaddai is a construction that means one of two things. In the Canaanite terminology, it would actually mean the god of the mountains or the god of the heights. In the Hebrew mythology, it means what? Anybody know? What is El Shaddai? You guys need to pull it up on your Old Testament. It means, depending on the way you want to look at it, it means basically God Almighty is the easiest way to put it in that. And so when Abraham meets God, God introduces himself as El Shaddai. It is not until Moses that God introduces himself as Jehovah or Yahweh. And so initially he introduces himself as God Almighty or God All-Sufficient, depending on how you want to look at it. So El Shaddai, it refers to the idea of God Almighty. So when Siegel and Schuster, who were two good Jewish boys from New York, write the book, they chose a name very deliberately for Superman, his secret name that is associated with the name of God, but not the not the Christian term that's used for God, Jehovah, but rather the Hebrew name that's used for God, Yahweh. And the reason seems to be tied into the idea that they're looking to create more of a Mosaic mythology with Superman. And so if you look at Superman in the early comics, yes, he is sent, away from Earth to escape what? What does Superman leave Krypton? Or why did his parents send him? Because it was exploding. Not a good place to be. So think about the Mosaic mythology. How is that similar to Moses' origin?
The blow-up that occurred in Egypt.
Okay, so his mother, in his case, but presumably his father was on board with this plan. That'd be an awkward conversation. Where's Moses? Well, I have this idea, see? And I got this wooden little boat and stuck him in it and sent him out in the reeds. Good work, I guess. So with Moses, he is escaping a disaster that's happening to his people. The genocide, it's a genocide that's being committed against the Jewish people by the Egyptians. So Moses is sent away, and ultimately he's called out of Egypt entirely by God, who then sends him back again, and when he sends him back again, he is empowered with special abilities, although ultimately it's not really Moses' abilities, it's God's abilities, but he comes back with special abilities in order to rescue his people. And Superman, I'm getting these things mixed up. Superman is sent to Earth with the explicit idea that he's going to help out the people of Earth. So he's sent away from a disaster to help other people. So there's a lot of similarities in that story. Now that was what you had originally, but as time passed and Superman became more and more powerful, and also there was something else that happened. So when Superman was created, it was created during the Great Depression, during a period of time when people needed stories of hope and heroism and things like that. And he's created and printed on very, very cheap paper so kids could buy it even though they didn't have very much money. But he was created initially as this American-centric hero. What would have happened that would have brought him out of the American-centric focus into a more of a world focus soon after he was created? World War II. So what happens is that Superman, although he's the first major comic book hero to be created in this kind of a likeness, very quickly a number of other ones followed after him.
Just to back up a little bit too, the origin story of Superman and Moses, Moses was sent to save a people, just as Superman was sent to save a people. Both had the capacity to do good. Yes.
Both the characters themselves and the people that he's sent to are people who maybe don't know what they're capable of yet, but they are capable of doing good things. And here again, given that this was such a Depression era when people are struggling and they're trying to find a way through, there's this idea of creating a hope situation for Americans and something they sort of locked in on. So when he's originally created, very soon after that, because his books start to sell really well, you start to have Batman and Flash and Green Lantern and a whole host of different characters. Most of them are not the characters that we're used to today. They are older versions of them, and most of their power had origins more in magic than they did in the more scientific or pseudo-scientific explanations that are given for most of those characters today. So a whole host of what we would call pulp or comic heroes come soon after Superman, and as World War II begins, or as the US becomes involved in World War II, all of them become involved in some way or the other in fighting against the Axis powers and their superhumans, who are mostly Aryan, blonde-haired, blue-eyed superhuman characters that are designed to sort of, or else they're explicitly very Japanese or something like that, to create a very clear, not only philosophical, but also to a certain degree a racial distinction between the two sides. And so there's a global aspect to Superman, and that's when his powers start to ramp up, because as the stakes get bigger, the powers get bigger. And so there's a series of different time periods when it comes to comics. There's the golden age of comics, that is considered to be up through the 40s basically, and early 50s, and then in the 50s there are comic books, really superhero comic books begin to die off, and they're replaced by what some of you may think of more than I do when we talk about comic books, the Disney comic books and the Archie and Jughead comic books and those kinds of things, comic books. And those books kind of become ascendant for a period of time. And then in the late 1960s and early now some of the books like Superman and Batman continue to be published, but they're published at very low levels, and the characters are kind of brought into a different kind of approach than the more serious approach that was done early on. So in the 1960s, there is a change, the late 1960s, and some characters start to be reinvented, like the Flash and Green Lantern as a more pseudo-scientific thing, and superhero comics begin to rise up again. This is known as the Silver Age of comics. It runs from the early 1970s through the 1980s, basically. And during the Silver Age, actually late 1960s anyway, during the Silver Age, Superman's powers just go nuts. He's moving planets around with his hands, and he's causing the whole world to forget things by using something called super amnesia, which sounds like a really terrible power to have. And he's able to do just about anything. He can fly at super, light speeds across galaxies and things like that. So in the 1980s, that's kind of scaled back to make it a little bit more relatable, and this is oftentimes known as the modern era of comics. And most Superman movies, including the one that had Christopher Reeve in it, are set largely in the modern era, where the powers are scaled back a little bit, although they're still vastly beyond anything a human being could do. And so it is during that modern era, the later part of the Silver Era and the early part of the Silver Age and the early part of the modern era, where Superman begins to move explicitly away from the Mosaic model and increasingly more towards the Christ model. And we see that in both of those two trailers we watched a minute ago. What are some of the things in those trailers that seem to tie into a Christ-based mythology?
Well, I keep thinking how and the Superman could hear his father, but his father was kind of like just all around.
Okay, so that's an interesting idea. Now, technically, what's happening is they're doing a voiceover of something that he sees, but he does actually get instructions from his Kryptonian father, his heavenly father, in a sense, I suppose. He does get instructions from him early on in the Fortress of Solitude, and as kind of almost a ghost that almost nobody else can ever see, he is actually receiving communication from him that gives him a sense of what his purpose is, that the average person doesn't have. And that's an interesting one. I never really thought about that one. So, Jerry.
The appearance of Superman is very, very close to what a lot of people believe Christ looked like.
Okay, so the modern day Judeo-Christian version of Christ is usually a white guy with dark hair and blue eyes, probably wildly inaccurate actually, considering the time period in which Jesus grew up and where he grew up. He probably would have looked more like an Arab than he does like an American, a white American like me or something like that. But nevertheless, there is an appearance element of that where he does kind of have that similarity. What else? What else do we see in those trailers that seems to be trying to explicitly or implicitly link him to the Christ mythology, or the Christ, I shouldn't say mythology, the Christ story?
Well, he looks up every so often and you get this brilliant sun. And
okay. So one of the things is Superman's powers derive from the sun, incidentally. And so one of the things is you often see the sun featuring in in the things that he's doing, and flying into the sun, not into the sun, but flying up into sunlight and all of that kind of stuff. You see that imagery of light that's associated with him.
It's stated that humanity had the potential for good, they just needed the light to show them the way.
Okay, so they need someone to show them the way, and that's why Jor-El has sent them, and he even says this, you're my only son. You know, I've sent them him to you to them to do that, to lead them into the light. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of different ways that this is made increasingly clear. And then if you actually watch the movie Man of Steel, there's a scene in this movie that if you weren't sure that this was what they were going for before, it's definitely clear that that's what's happening here. Let me set this up just a minute here. Superman has only, in Man of Steel, he has not embraced his identity as Superman until the events of the movie. So actually he's been kind of going along as a human, disguising himself as a human and kind of occasionally doing heroic things just on the down low, I guess, so to speak, without people knowing who he is or identifying him specifically. And it's only in this movie that he finds out his heritage and he begins to embrace his powers and he puts on the costume and stuff. And at that same time, a character called Zod, who is very much the Satan character in the movie, shows up and is trying to gain control of it because he has within him the genetic codes for the Kryptonian race and the ability through him to basically, by the way, if we're not already clear about mythology here again, to resurrect the Kryptonian race, basically through what is in his genetics. So Zod wants to get control of him, and ultimately Superman surrenders himself to humanity, who turns him over to Zod. Again, are you picking up on anything here? In order to avoid a war. And so Superman is taken up to Zod's ship, where his powers are temporarily taken away from him by the atmosphere on the ship. Lois Lane ends up there on board the ship with him as well, where she encounters, because they took this code key that has access to Jor-El, Superman's father's information. She plugs him into the ship, and now he is reawakened within that ship, and he is guiding her to escape the ship and also to do things that will release Superman from the ship's control. So, first of all, we have some very, very clear connections when we talk about, you know, the Superman being handed over by humanity to evil. We talk about him being disempowered and basically taken away from his source of power, all of which is very much similar to the crucifixion elements of it. And then we have this. So let's see if we can get this to go. Maybe not. So that's actually a picture from there. This is the actual scene. Maybe. There it is. Okay. No, it still isn't.
Secure yourself inside the open pod. Safe travels, Miss Lane. It's highly unlikely we'll be seeing each other again. Remember, the Phantom drives were essential in stopping them. Will you head for that?
Said about the Codex. Strike them.
We wanted you to army meant to be human first. So that one day, when the time was right, you could be the bridge between two peoples. Look. Pause. You can speak like that. You can stay forward.
All right. The previous picture, by the way, let me go back here for a second. This is actually from the earlier Superman movie that I showed you. He has, in this particular movie, he is able to lift this gigantic landmass that Lex Luthor, who's the devil character in that comic or in that movie, has created that is basically threatening the east coast of the United States. He lifts it up, but it's got kryptonite in it, so he pushes it into space and then falls back to Earth. And this is a brief picture that you see of him falling back to Earth. So in both of these scenes, what do we see explicitly in the imagery?
Crucifixion.
A crucifixion pose in both situations. And in the Man of Steel, it's made even more explicit because his father the memory of his father basically says to him right before he assumes that position, says what to him?
You can save them.
You can save all of them, you know? And so there's this very clear idea that Superman is the savior of the world. And then he assumes that crucifixion pose, which is completely unnecessary in the context of what's happening on the screen. This one actually makes a little more sense because when you're unconscious, you just kind of flop around. But in the previous one, he's conscious, and yet he assumes a position that's actually kind of unnatural. But it is, and it's tied into this music that's, you know, kind of ascendant and everything else. And so it is made very, very clear that Superman, and we don't want to watch that again, that Superman is the savior of the world. And so the mythology there is powerful, and there is some benefit to that for us as Christians in terms of being able to kind of give sort of example by metaphor to someone who has very little idea about Christ, but ultimately it's also deeply problematic. And I've talked a little bit already in the previous, let me see if we're at the end of this, okay. So I've talked a little bit previously about some of the ways that the similarities could perhaps be used, but one of the problems with Superman, one of the complexities of Superman is that most of the stuff that Superman has become so over the top, obviously Christian in its symbolism, or Christ-centered in its symbolism, that you'd have to be pretty unaware of Christ in any sense to not recognize the symbolism if somebody starts pointing it out to you. Now, how many of you have seen some of these movies? Okay, there's a few of you raising your hands. How many of you have ever thought about these movies in this context? Okay, so one of you did, all right? I would point out to the other person with a postdoctoral or postgraduate degree. But anyway, so it isn't necessarily immediately hit you over the head obvious if you're not thinking about it. I think about this kind of thing all the time because I'm constantly looking for examples. I don't go looking, like actively looking for examples for my sermons. I just learn to pay attention to the world around me and to think about it through the lens of the fact that I'm writing sermons all the time and I see examples because of that. So it's not difficult to see that if you're looking. If you're not looking, it's a little bit easier to overlook it, but it does become more obvious as soon as somebody points it out.
The two gentlemen that started Superman,
Siegel and Schuster.
both were Jews.
Correct.
Why would they begin with the imagery of Christ?
Well, again, it didn't begin that way. They began with a Mosaic pattern, not so much a Christ pattern. So they began with the idea of, so this is where we go back to answer your question, we go back to an older point that I made, which has to do with the heroic mythology more broadly. Heroic mythology is built, if it's successful, it pulls on things that we have in our consciousness about what heroism looks like, even if we don't necessarily think about it actively. So when you look at heroes, there are aspects of their stories that tend to have similarities to other heroes. And so it's more than likely true that what Siegel and Schuster were doing, whether they meant to do it entirely this way or not, was they were pulling on mythologies, or in their case, stories that they were familiar with about biblical characters, and they were looking to create a story that would link to things that people were familiar with in the biblical stories that they were aware of. So it wasn't so much that they were trying to create a biblical analogy as it was that they were writing a story and they were pulling from kind of some of the stuff they knew, the battle between good and evil and aspects of that kind of stuff. Let me get Steve and then I'll come back to you.
I think when it comes to cinema or Hollywood or the movies, there's lots of stories. If you take Lord of the Rings and different things, they write the Hobbits, all that. Yeah, so what do? They fantasize certain things that are true in the Bible. They fantasize them and they turn them into something that's not real. And so for a couple of Jewish guys to use Christ's imagery doesn't mean they support Christ.
Right.
But it's a great story in the Bible, in the New Testament. And so one has to counter whether or not you're seeing Christ in Superman, for instance, or whether or not you're seeing the fallacy of the actual story of Christ as it's being portrayed in a fanciful, non-real way.
And non-biblical way.
Exactly.
And
So are they making fun of Christ or minimizing
Right.
him?
And we're going to talk more about that in just a second here. Let me see
Okay.
if Jerry's got another question that's back on the original
I
one.
just had a thought. The premise that you're making would apply in my thinking to any hero. That you can look at some of the people, Audie Murphy, and getting what he did as in the Second World War, or any of the guys that have won the Medal of Honor.
Mhm.
They're heroes by their actions that almost duplicate what you're talking about.
Right. And that takes...
that to me is, it makes it, it just a hero, I guess.
You're right about, in the general sense, that's true. And that goes back, like I said, to this idea of the heroic mythology, or the hero's journey, where you're looking at notions of heroism that aren't just biblical, that aren't just... They may be old mythology and legends. They may incorporate elements of heroism in the sense that we see people do heroic things from time to time. There's not a singular source for this kind of stuff, any more than there would have been for Superman. There's elements of Samson that are integrated into him. Elements, actually, in fact, his costume, his early costume, is actually patterned off of a circus strongman's costume. And so there's a lot of different stuff that kind of gets mashed together in this. It's not just one thing. But in Superman's case, it's unusual because of the increasing reliance on, or tying into, Christian imagery and Christian themes as they portray Superman in movies, in particular in movies. In the comics, you don't see this nearly as much. But in the movies, and in the TV shows, not nearly as much either. It's the movies where they really do this a lot.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but why you're using Superman as an example here is he, like Christ, is tempted, right? But he doesn't succumb to that. All of the other fictional superheroes, or even heroes like real-life Medal of Honor recipients, were fallible characters.
Right.
And they were subject to sin, whereas it appears Superman is able to rise above that and not succumb to those temptations.
There's an element of that, and certainly Hollywood traditionally has portrayed him more that way, where there is not a lot of nuance to his goodness. He typically is portrayed as making the right decisions, doing the right thing, never succumbing to the temptation to kill his inaction. In fairness, if you go back to the golden age of comics, Batman and Superman killed people all the time. It was not actually abnormal. And some of the characters, some of the heroic characters were like, they would have been considered mass murderers by any modern standard, because they just killed people left and right. It was a lot easier to kill somebody than it was to keep fighting them over and over again. But in the modern era, again, we have Superman who's been sort of redefined. And so there is definitely elements of that where Superman is the purest distillation of Hollywood's fascination with Christianity and Christian imagery and stuff like that. Other characters have elements of it, but Superman in the modern era at least has more of that. And there's problems associated with that, and Steve begins to highlight those for us, which is because this isn't Christ. There's a lot of there's a lot of potential for abuse of this, because, and it goes back to something I said in the very first lesson, the very first day we talked about this. We have to remember that any character that we see on a television, on a movie screen, on the internet, anything that is created, a character that is a created character, and that even includes, in many cases, a lot of these reality television personalities and podcast characters, people who do this, they've created an image for themselves. They are rarely exactly like that in real life. This is who they want people to see them as. You listen to radio hosts, and some of them are just as over the top and grating and irritating as you can possibly imagine. You meet them in real life, not like that at all. But they created that personality because it drums up listeners and people paying attention to them. But the point is that these characters are written by the people who created them, or by the people who created the specific character that you're seeing on screen or on TV or whatever. They were created, and they can manipulate them however they want them to be. So just because in a given moment you're like, oh, that's got some Christ imagery to it, doesn't mean that necessarily that has the biblical concepts backing it up that would make that something that's particularly healthy to consume, while conflating it too much with the Christian, or with Christian doctrines and ideology and stuff like that. So it becomes very dangerous to not be able to see the parallels, because if we're not seeing the parallels, we're being influenced by the parallels in ways that we may not really understand. And that gives Hollywood the ability to mess with the way that we think about those things. Because if we think about it and we switch it around and flip it to the other side, the question becomes, what are some of the things about Superman that really don't resemble the Christ mythology very well? So we're going to just touch on this briefly, and that's going to be your homework assignment, by the way.
He's not God. He's not the Son of God.
So right off the bat, we've got the fact that he's not God, he's not the Son of God, okay? What else? What are some of the other problematic aspects of Superman as a Christ metaphor?
Christ doesn't fly.
Okay, well, I mean, there was one time, but that was just a one time. So, by the way, that's an imagery in Man of Steel that's very much tied into the idea of the ascendancy of Christ at that point. But Christ doesn't normally fly. What else does Christ not normally do that Superman goes around doing?
See Lois Lane.
Okay,
Every time.
Healing.
Okay, so Christ does healing. Superman beats people up. And I don't mean that to be like simplistic or insulting, but Superman solves problems primarily through the application of great physical strength to the situation. Superman's tendency is to fight against evil by actively fighting against evil. How does Jesus fight against evil? What does he do?
Well, he's good.
Okay, so part of it is he teaches to change minds. And what's the other thing? What did you say, Steve?
He combats evil with good.
Okay, so he combats evil not through physical conflict. The only examples we ever see of Jesus engaging in some sort of physical conflict is in the temple, when he starts overturning tables and driving at animals. We never see Jesus hitting anybody, beating anybody up, threatening anyone with physical violence, that kind of stuff. How does Jesus ultimately save the world? Through self-sacrifice and death, not by fighting against evil in terms of beating Satan up, but because he's fighting a spiritual battle, not a physical one.
He saves people from sin, not just physical harm.
Okay, and he's saving them from something much more serious than physical harm when you get right down to it. He's saving them from sin, which is a more complex problem than physical danger is anyway. So when we start to look at the really critical aspects of who Christ is and what he did, we start to realize that Superman doesn't actually represent those very well. He can't represent those very well without stepping outside of the Superman mythology, and he gets us focusing on kind of the wrong way of dealing with evil when we start to think about the Superman way of dealing with it.
He sets himself up as somebody really impressive after he does things or while he's doing things, whereas Jesus tries to keep that tamped down.
Okay, so one of the things we see, and it's not so much that Superman goes around glorifying himself, because that's one of the things he consciously doesn't do in most mythologies. That's one of the reasons that he's considered the hero that he is. But inevitably, because of the things that he does, being these larger-than-life escapades, he is constantly seen as being larger than life and above people and stuff like that. And what Jesus does is the opposite of that. He comes to earth, and what does Paul say in Philippians about the nature of what Jesus did when he came to earth? He says, Jesus, being in very nature God, did not think that his deity was something to be grasped or held onto, but instead did what?
Lowered himself.
Lowered himself and became as a man. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but he becomes he has all the weaknesses of humanity. He is temptable, he is physically frail the same way all of us are. I'm not saying he was a weakling, I'm saying all of us are physically frail. You put a human being in an arena with a bear and things are not going to go well for the human being unless we've had a chance to gather, some stuff from a hunting store ahead of time, So the simple fact is humans are relatively frail, and Jesus comes with all of our weaknesses. He comes as a baby who's just as vulnerable as anybody else is. He grows into a man who is just as human as we are in terms of being temptable, in terms of being killable. Now, he knows who he is, and he makes all the right choices, but that's all the more impressive because he is limited like that. And Superman doesn't have that. Superman lacks most of our vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and the TV shows and movies struggle to portray him as a relatable character for that very reason.
I think a lot of the stories that we hear about in the movies we see, we come away with, well, I wish I had some of those powers. Or I wish, when you watch Bewitched, I wish I could do that, or I wish, I wish I had magical powers or whatever. And it's because we admire supernatural things or whatever, the abilities that are portrayed. And then, I'll just go out and do good, and I'll be a superhero. But we should be looking at Christ that way. We should say, I need to emulate him. That is my superhero.
Right. And one of the reasons for that is because, now Christ could do miracles, and that's true, but most of the good that Christ did was not through doing miracles. And we get confused about that sometimes, I think, because of how many miracles are talked about in the Bible. But ultimately, Christ's value to humanity was not the people he healed, because if you think about the number of people that he healed, even if it was like, 10 times as many as the Bible actually recounts, it's still a tiny fraction of the number of people that were just there in the area where he was living, much less in the world as a whole. His value to the human race was not because of the miracles that he did, it was because of what he taught, and more importantly, the sacrifice that he made of himself. And so when we think about heroism in those terms, it alters the way that we perceive heroic characters that are portrayed on screen. All right, we are over time, so I want to give you your assignment. All of you had, and many of you turned back in, but sitting up here on this chair is a worksheet. And that worksheet goes through, and first of all, it asks you to look at Mark chapter 2, verses 13 through 17, to think about some questions there relating to Jesus' interaction with people. But then what it does is it asks you to go through, after watching the movie clips or the trailers and stuff that we've looked at here, and see what's displayed that are analogies to fundamental biblical principles. In other words, similar to biblical principles, and what scriptures that might support not the movie, but the biblical principles themselves. And then the final question, well, there's another one, but the other big question is, what are some of the differences? Where are some of the ways where the movie clip runs contrary to biblical principles, and what scriptures could be used to demonstrate the conflict? Because it's important to realize that when we encounter pop culture, we aren't just encountering pop culture in the sense of saying, okay, that's all bad, you shouldn't watch it. Because the overwhelming majority of people that you interact with are not going to listen to that if you tell them that. So instead, what we need to be able to do is to be able to point out, okay, here's where some ideas that you might get from this have relationships to Christianity, but also here's where there are some differences. And you can use the differences to help explain. Just as Jesus in his parables used the analogies, the similarities of the parables to illustrate, heavenly principles, he also used them sometimes to illustrate problematic behaviors and things that people are doing wrong. So I want you to think about both of those aspects of this for next week. So if you don't have one of those 4 sheets, or if you've lost it or whatever, grab one from the chair up here and take it with you if you're planning to be here next week, so you can work on that a little bit this week and think about that some. And in particular, because some of this stuff you can just think of on the fly, but I want you to think about it particularly in terms of some of the scriptural principles that you would, the scriptures that you would use to support the underlying arguments that you're making. I tell my students, an argument is only as good as the support, the evidence that you give for it. I think is a great place to start, but if you end there, why should I care what you think? Now, if you're the president of the United States, then maybe you have some weight behind your statements of what I think. But for most of us, we need evidence. Okay, so pick one of those up. But for now, we're going to take a break for about 10 minutes, and we'll be back at 10:30 to get started with our worship.